Elements of rhetorical situations. There is no singular rhetorical situation that applies to all instances of communication. Rather, all human efforts to communicate occur within innumerable individual rhetorical situations that are particular to those specific moments of communication. An awareness of rhetorical situations can help in both composition and analysis. In the textbook Writing Today, Johnson, Sheehan, and Payne recommend, before you start writing any text, you should first gain an understanding of your rhetorical situation. 12. The rest of this resource will focus on understanding the rhetorical situation. Once you know how to identify and analyze the elements of rhetorical situations, you will be better able to produce writing that meets your audience's needs, fits the specific setting you write in, and conveys your intended message and purpose. Each individual rhetorical situation shares 5 basic elements with all other rhetorical situations. 1. A text, i.e., an actual instance or piece of communication. 2. An author, i.e., someone who uses communication. 3. An audience, i.e., a recipient of communication. 4. Purposes, i.e., the varied reasons both authors and audiences communicate. 5. A setting, i.e., the time, place, and environment surrounding a moment of communication. These 5 terms are updated versions of similar terms that the ancient Greek thinker Aristotle articulated over 2,000 years ago. While Aristotle's terms may be familiar to many people, his terminology more directly applied to the specific needs and concerns of his day. This resource uses more current terminology to more accurately identify the kinds of rhetorical situations we may encounter today. But since Aristotle's work in rhetoric has been so influential, below is a brief discussion of Aristotle's terms and how they relate to the terms in this resource: text, author, audience, purposes, and setting. 1. Text. What is a text? The word text is probably the most fluid term in a rhetorical situation. Usually, the word text refers to a written or typed document. In terms of a rhetorical situation, however, text means any form of communication that humans create. Whenever humans engage in any act of communication, a text serves as the vehicle for communication. 3 basic factors affect the nature of each text: the medium of the text, the tools used to create the text, and the tools used to decipher the text. Medium of a text. Text can appear in any kind of medium, or mechanism for communicating. The plural of medium in this sense is media. Various media affect the ways that authors and audiences communicate. Consider how these different types of media can affect how and what authors communicate to audiences in various rhetorical situations: handwritten, typed, computer-generated, audio, visual, spoken, verbal, nonverbal, graphic, pictorial, tactile, with words, or without words. There are many others, of course. Some varied specific examples of media could include a paper, a speech, a letter, an advertisement, a billboard, a presentation, a poster board, a cartoon, a movie, a painting, a sculpture, an email, a Twitter tweet, a Facebook post, graffiti, a conversation, face-to-face, on a cell phone, via text messages. This list is nearly endless. Tools to make a text. Every text is made with tools that affect the structure and content of a text. Such tools could be physical tools that range from very basic, such as the larynx, throat, teeth, lips, and tongue necessary for verbal communication, to very complex, such as a laptop computer with graphic manipulating software. These tools could also be more conceptual tools that range from simple, such as implementing feedback from an instructor, to more complicated, such as implementing different kinds of library and primary research. The tools of communication often determine the kinds of communication that can happen in any given rhetorical situation. Tools to decipher a text. Likewise, audiences have varied tools for reading, viewing, hearing, or otherwise appreciating various texts. These could be actual physical tools that would likewise range from very basic, like the eyes and reading glasses necessary to read, to very complex, like a digital projector and screen to view a PowerPoint presentation. Or they could be conceptual tools that could range from simple, childhood principles learned from parents, to more complicated, a master's degree in art. The tools that audiences have at their disposal affect the ways that they appreciate different texts. 2. 3. Author and audience. What is an author? Author is a fairly loose term used to refer to anyone who uses communication. An author could be one person or many people. An author could be someone who uses writing, like in a book, speech, like in a debate, visual elements, like in a TV commercial, audio elements, like in a radio broadcast, or even tactile elements, as is used in making braille, to communicate. Whatever authors create, authors are human beings whose particular activities are affected by their individual backgrounds. Many factors affect authors' backgrounds. These can include age, gender, geographic location, ethnicity, cultural experiences, religious experiences, social standing, personal wealth, sexuality, political beliefs, parents, peers, level of education, personal experience, and others. All of these are powerful influences on what authors assume about the world, who their audiences are, what and how they communicate, and the settings in which they communicate. Gender, ethnicity, cultural experiences, sexuality, and wealth factors are especially important in analyzing rhetorical situations today. Many professionals in education, business, government, and nonprofit organizations are especially aware of these specific factors in people's lives. What is audience? Like the term author, the term audience is also a fairly loose term. Audience refers to any recipient of communication. Audiences can read, hear, see, or feel different kinds of communication through different kinds of media. Also, like authors, audiences are human beings whose particular activities are also affected by their specific backgrounds. Audience's background. The same sorts of factors that affect authors' backgrounds also affect audiences' individual backgrounds. Most importantly, these factors affect how audiences receive different pieces of communication, what they assume about the author, and the context in which they hear, read, or otherwise appreciate what the author communicates. 4. Purposes. Authors and audiences both have a wide range of purposes for communicating. The importance of purpose in rhetorical situations cannot be overstated. It is the varied audience's purposes. Authors' purposes tend to be almost exclusive active, if only because authors conscientiously create texts for specific audiences. But audiences' purposes may range from more passive purpose to more active purposes. Table, audience purposes. More passive purposes, more active purposes: to receive notice, to examine, to feel reassured, to quantify, to feel a sense of unity, to assess, to be entertained, to make informed decisions, to receive instruction, to interpret, to enjoy, to evaluate, to hear advice, to judge, to be inspired, to resist change, to review, to criticize. The role of purposes. Authors and audiences' purposes in communicating determine the basic rationale behind other decisions both authors and audiences make, such as what to write or speak about, or whom to listen to, or what medium to use, or what setting to read in, among others. An author's purpose in communicating could be to instruct, persuade, inform, entertain, educate, startle, excite, sadden, enlighten, punish, console, or many, many others. Like authors, audiences have varied purposes for reading, listening to, or otherwise appreciating pieces of communication. Audiences may seek to be instructed, persuaded, informed, entertained, educated, startled, excited, saddened, enlightened, punished, consoled, or many, many others. Authors and audiences' purposes are only limited to what authors and audiences want to accomplish in their moments of communication. There are as many purposes for communicating as there are words to describe those purposes. Attitude. Attitude is related to purpose and is a much overlooked element of rhetorical situations. But attitude affects a great deal of how a rhetorical situation unfolds. Consider if an author communicates with a flippant attitude as opposed to a serious attitude, or with drama as opposed to comedy, or calmly as opposed to excitedly. Depending on authors' purposes, audiences' specific qualities, the nature of the context, and other factors, any of these attitudes could either help or hinder authors in their efforts to communicate depending on the other factors in any given rhetorical situation. Like authors, audiences bring diverse attitudes to how they appreciate different pieces of communication. The audience's attitude while reading, listening, observing, or whatnot affects how they receive and process the communication they receive. 5. Setting. Lastly, all rhetorical situations occur in specific settings or contexts or environments. The specific constraints that affect a setting include the time of author and audience, the place of author and audience, and the community or conversation in which authors and/or audiences engage. Time. Time in this sense refers to specific moments in history. It is fairly common knowledge that different people communicate differently depending on the time in which they live. Americans in the 1950s, overall, communicate differently than Americans in the 2000s. Not that they necessarily speak a different language, but these two groups of people have different assumptions about the world and how to communicate based on the era in which they live. Different moments in time can be closer together and still affect the ways that people communicate. Certainly, scientists discussed physics somewhat differently the year after Einstein published his theory of relativity than they did the year before Einstein published his treatise. Also, an author and audience may be located at different times in relation to one another. Today, we appreciate Shakespeare's Hamlet a bit differently than the people who watched it when it first premiered 400 years ago. A lot of cultural norms have changed since then. Place. Similarly, the specific places of authors and their audiences affect the ways that texts are made and received. At a rally, the place may be the steps of a national monument. In an academic conference or lecture hall or court case, the place is a specific room. In other rhetorical situations, the place may be the pages of an academic journal in which different authors respond to one another in essay form. And, as mentioned about authors and audiences' backgrounds, the places from which audiences and authors emerge affect the ways that different texts are made and received. Community, conversation. In various rhetorical situations, community or conversation can be used to refer to the specific kinds of social interactions among authors and audiences. Outside of speaking about rhetorical situations, community usually means specific groups of people united by location and proximity, like a neighborhood. Conversation usually refers to fairly intimate occasions of discussion among a small number of people. But in regard to rhetorical situations, both of these terms can have much larger meanings. In any given rhetorical situation, community and conversation can refer to the people specifically involved in the act of communication. For instance, consider Pablo Picasso, who used Cubism to challenge international notions of art at the time he painted. Picasso was involved in a worldwide community of artists, art critics, and other appreciators of art, many of whom were actively engaged in an extended conversation with differing assumptions about what art is and ought to be. Sometimes, authors and audiences participate in the same community and conversation, but in many instances, authors may communicate in one community and conversation. Again, think of Shakespeare 400 years ago in England, while audiences may participate in a different community and conversation. Think of scholars today in any other country in the world who discuss and debate the nature of Shakespeare's plays. The specific nature of authors' communities and conversations affect the ways that texts are made, while the specific nature of audiences' communities and conversations affect the ways that texts are received and appreciated.